Chapter 2. The spiral staircase rose in front of Owen Walters into the dark sky, and he noticed the steps were actually hardcover books. They rose up so far he couldn't see where they ended. Cautiously, he stepped onto the first book step. It gave a little under his weight, but held. He slowly made his way up the spiral staircase. The first few steps felt awkward. His balance was shaky, and he had nothing to grab onto. As he made his way higher and higher, he tried to see if the book steps had titles. They did not, but they all had the same brown leather covers. After what felt like a significant amount of time, Owen looked up to see how far he'd traveled. The sky was dark and featureless. There was no telling, so he looked down. The ground was just as dark. He stood in place, refusing to take another step. He was starting to regret having made the climb in the first place. He looked to his wrist, only to remember he didn't have a watch in which to tell the time. All he had on was his black, blood-covered hoodie and jeans. The blood belonged to his dear friend Alyssa Turner. He looked up again, hoping to see something, anything, but only saw darkness. A horrible loneliness gripped him. He had no idea where he was. He saw nothing but the books on which he stood, spiraling upward. He grabbed his blonde, sweaty hair and tried to pull it out in frustration. "They have to go somewhere," he thought. With that in mind, he continued to climb, determined to discover where these steps led. After what felt like 10 minutes, Owen stopped and looked up again. Now he saw something. Whatever it was dark, but not as dark as its surroundings. He decided to climb some more. He climbed more energetically now that he saw his destination. After a few more minutes, he could practically feel the object above him taking up the space around it. He was close enough to see what it was. It was an orb. It was the orb. But it was much larger than Owen remembered. The one he had, the one he'd taken from Michael and his brother Jason, was the size of a bowling ball, and appeared to be made of polished red marble. This orb, though appearing to be made of the same polished marble, was the size of a car. The steps actually widened around it. Owen stared at the object that seemed to be floating in midair. This didn't surprise him because there was nothing supporting the book steps either. There was a low-level hum coming from the massive orb. Owen was tempted to touch it, but was afraid of what might happen if he did. He thought back to what happened the last time it had been activated. A weird pulse had shot out of it and spread in all directions. His friend, Chris Weaver, had managed to deactivate it, but there was no telling what kind of damage it had already done. No, Owen didn't know much about this orb, but he knew one thing. He'd had a hand in creating it. But for what? What did the orb do? Owen had no clue. Whatever it did, it was apparently worth killing for, and now it was in his possession. He looked at his surroundings once again. It was still too dark to tell where he was, but it didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the orb floating before him. He placed his hands upon its shiny surface. It felt warm and slimy. The humming instantly grew more intense. Owen tried to pull his hands away, but couldn't. He was stuck to it. And now the massive orb began to glow. A bright light ignited from the center and expanded outward. Owen looked in the center. It was as if he were looking down into the bottom of a pool, with his head just above the surface of the water. He was mesmerized. He woke up to find he was holding the orb now, but it was no longer the size of a car. It was back to the bowling ball size he was accustomed to. Much like its dream counterpart, this orb was also glowing. He dropped it. The moment it hit the ground, the light faded away. He watched it for a moment to make sure it didn't do anything else. Then he looked around. He was in a candle-lit room. There were windows placed high on the walls. Very little moonlight shone into the room due to the thick cloud cover. "What are you doing?" a voice asked, making Owen jump. In one corner of the room stood a young woman, wearing a purple shirt and jeans. She studied him, a curious grin on her face. "Nothing, Nicky. I mean, I don't know what happened. Bad dream." Nicky stepped closer, glancing down at the orb. She combed her strawberry blonde hair behind her ears. "Were you messing with that thing? I saw light coming from this room." "I wasn't messing with it. I had a dream I was touching the orb. Then I woke up and I was holding it. I didn't mean to," he added defensively. "You dreamt of it before finally obtaining it," Nicky mused, "and continue to do so now that you have it? How weird." It was true, but the dreams Owen had before were different. Back then, he dreamt he was tinkering with and testing it on animals. Now that he had the orb in his possession, he was dreaming about turning it on. Then it hit him. What had he just done with it? He knew he activated something, but it wasn't the same thing Michael and Jason had done. At least, Owen hoped it wasn't. Nicky picked up the orb and studied it, rolling it around in her hands. Owen had brought it to her hoping she could tell him what it was, but so far she'd been unable to. Nor was she able to tell him how he was connected to it, and to Michael. All she could tell him was that he and Michael were two halves of a whole, something Michael himself confirmed during Owen's last encounter with him. None of it made any sense to Owen, and it was maddening. Up until a few days ago, everything was going great for him and his friends. He, Chris, Daniel, and Alyssa had been fighting monsters and having fun. Now everything was wrong. "I wish I could tell you more about this thing," Nicky said as she set the orb down on a table. "But when I look at it, I see nothing." "What do you mean?" "I mean literally nothing. My mind goes blank whenever I try to look deeper into it." "What should we do?" he asked. "I may not be able to see into it, but perhaps I'll have a better chance by looking into the one who made it." Owen looked directly into her eyes. "You mean me?" he asked. "Well, you did say you had dreams of building it, right?" "I already told you I don't know anything." "You said you built it." "I said I had a dream I was building it, but how could I have actually done it? I'm only 16, and I can remember everything I've done for the past 10 years. I think I'd remember this." He pointed to the orb. Nicky sighed. "You came to me for help. I'm trying to help," she said irritably. "I know. I'm sorry. I just—" Owen paused. A metallic figure with a clear, white shell stepped into the room to join him and Nicky. "I just don't understand why this is happening. Daniel and Alyssa are dead. Chris is missing. All I have left is Dee," Owen said, indicating the robot in the doorway. In a single night, Michael had destroyed Owen's life, taking away everything he held dear. Owen couldn't go home since the police had discovered Daniel's body there.
I'm sorry about your friends,
Nicky said kindly.
Although I don't know where Chris is, I know he's not dead.
How do you know that? Owen asked as he wiped away a single tear that managed to roll down his cheek.
I just do.
Owen stared at Dee. The robot stared back with its piercing blue eyes. We shouldn't focus on Chris now, he said. I think we need to talk about Michael and his brother. Nicky smiled.
I agree.
It was pretty clear to Owen that Nicky enjoyed, to a certain extent, talking about Michael. Owen figured it was because Michael was a mystery, and Nicky, who was used to reading regular people's boring fortunes, enjoyed trying to unravel it. She and Owen were in a different room now, one that looked like a small warehouse. It was the very same room where they first met. The only difference now was that Chris wasn't there with them. The two of them sat across from each other at a round table covered with a purple tablecloth. Owen knew that Nicky could see the truth in things if presented with a little information about a given situation, and that she liked purple. She had known that Owen and Michael were connected somehow, that they both possessed the same superhuman strength, from as little information as Michael's name and physical description. But when it came to Michael and Jason, all she could tell was that the two of them were blood-related, nothing more. She claimed she could tell Owen everything if she could meet them, but chances of that being arranged were slim to none. What can you tell me? Owen asked, looking Nicky straight in the eyes.
Depends on what you can tell me.
I've already told you everything I know. She sat back in her chair, looking like she was thinking deeply.
You know, something struck me when you mentioned knowing everything you've done in the past 10 years.
What?
I don't know,
she said bitterly, as if on the cusp of something she couldn't quite grasp.
Tell me about your past.
Like what, exactly?
Did anything significant happen?
My dad died 2 years ago.
How?
Nicky was anxious now. You can't see? He asked nervously. Nicky chewed on her lip as she shook her head.
I should be able to, but I can't, and that worries me.
He was killed in a meteor shower. Owen had told this story a few times to his closest friends. The event was how he wound up meeting Chris and the others in the first place. Though he couldn't remember most of what had happened directly after his father died, he did remember walking all the way from his hometown to San Sebastian. That was over 30 miles. Nicky narrowed her eyes at Owen and said,
I'm sorry, but I don't think that's true.
His eyes widened. Out of all things he was expecting Nicky to say, that wasn't one of them. What do you mean? He asked. That is what happened. I saw it.
I'm just not seeing it. If it were true, I would be able to see it.
Owen sat in silence for a moment, not sure how to react or what to say. Have you ever been wrong before? He finally asked.
No,
Nicky whispered instantly, still squinting, as if she was trying to see something far away. Stop looking at me like that, he said. It's freaking me out.
I'm sorry,
Nicky said as she opened her eyes.
Your past is horribly blurry.
Why would that be?
I guess one really good reason would be because you don't have one.
A past? That's impossible. I remember a lot of things from when I was a kid.
Give me an example,
she said, narrowing her eyes slightly, but not as much as before. I remember my best friend Colin Matthews. I remember always beating him in foot races. Nikki's eyes shot open suddenly.
I see that,
she screamed excitedly.
except I see it as the other way around. Him beating you.
Whatever, Owen said with a smile. I also remember my dad being a great cook. He made the best steaks in the world. Nikki sat for a moment in silence, then smiled slyly.
Boys are all the same. You all think your dads are the best at everything.
Owen laughed. For the first time in 24 hours, he felt good. He thought talking about his dad would be depressing, but it was having the opposite effect.
All right,
Nikki said.
I guess you do have a past, but it's foggier than any I've ever seen on a person. You're a mystery, Owen Walters.
More mysterious than Michael?
I'd say equally mysterious, but he has an excuse. He isn't here before me, and you are.
What about you? Owen asked. What's your story? Nikki shook her head.
You don't want to know my past. It's boring.
Try me. Nikki sighed.
Let's just say things didn't work out at home. My dad left when I told him my mom was having an affair.
An affair?
Yep. All I had to do was hear her voice to know it. I was only a little girl. If I had been a little older, I wouldn't have said anything at all.
Owen nodded. Nikki, about that thing you said to Chris, about our monster hunting group not being a good idea.
Yes?
She raised her eyebrows. What made you say that? Owen suddenly remembered how she had reminded Chris of something she'd told him long ago, before the group was officially formed, that doing so would be a terrible idea. Ever since Chris, Owen, and Alyssa joined Daniel's softball team, the Unstoppable Titans, they'd lost every game. And now Daniel and Alyssa were dead.
I just saw it. It's something I like to call the quartet's curse. When 4 people with certain abilities get together for a common goal, they are doomed to fail at it. And their future always proved lethal.
The quartet's curse? Owen grinned.
When you meet and help as many people as I have,
Nikki said, adjusting herself in her seat,
you see a lot of things, links to here and there. It took me a while to see the pattern, but yes, I have met a lot of people who have fallen into this curse.
Wait, what do you mean by abilities?
You should know by now, Owen.
Nikki said nothing else after that. It was 8 p.m., and there were at least a dozen people in the quote-unquote waiting room of the gift shop. Owen made his way through the crowd and outside onto the fairgrounds. He was standing in the middle of the old abandoned amusement park where Nikki had made her home and read fortunes. There was an old Ferris wheel on his right and a carousel on his left. A few more people were making their way through the entrance of the park, having paid the way at the box office. At first, Owen wasn't sure why he'd come outside in the first place. Then he remembered. He wanted to speak to Darlington. Owen walked across the relatively dark grounds and knocked on the door to the box office. He waited for over a minute, but there was no answer. He walked around to the front and tried looking through the window, but the inside was too dark to make out much. All he could see was a brief image of a ghostly white figure staring back at him. "Hey," Owen said to the figure as more people approached the box office behind him. "Can we talk?" The figure didn't respond. Owen stepped aside to let 2 girls and a guy pay admission. A long, pale hand reached out through a slot in the window to collect their money. After the kids left, Owen jumped back to the box office. "It's just, I don't really know you, and I wanted to fix that," he said kindly. "It must get lonely out here. Have you ever had anyone try to sneak in?" No response. Owen was getting nowhere with this guy. He wasn't even sure why he felt the need to try to connect with him. He gave up, waved goodbye, and walked back into the park. "He doesn't talk at all," Nicky told Owen after he told her about his attempt to speak with Darlington. "Why did you try talking to him anyway?" "I don't know. Something just told me to go out there. How did you two meet?" Nicky smiled, as if remembering something pleasant. "I met him a few years ago. He saved me. I was being attacked by some weird dog. He was my knight in shining armor, I guess you could say." "How did you guys end up here?" "Oh, this park has a history. I'm guessing Chris told you about that rich kid who built the place a long time ago. Then he just abandoned it, and everyone forgot about it. I got tired of living on the streets, though I wasn't out there for very long. I decided to check the place out. I couldn't believe it hadn't been demolished. Just forgotten, I guess." "And that's where you met Chris? On the streets?" Nicky nodded. "You know," she said, "it bugs me that your past is so mysterious, that I can't see into your memories." "Me too," Owen said. "I think I might know a way around that." "How?" Owen was lying flat on a mattress that he assumed was Darlington's. Nicky had finished readings for the day. Darlington himself was kneeling next to him, and Nicky was standing to the side, watching. Darlington was wearing gray sweatpants and a dirty white t-shirt. "I've never been hypnotized before," Owen said anxiously. "It won't hurt," Nicky said. "I mean, I don't think it will. I've only seen Darlington do this once." Darlington started placing his hands on either side of Owen's head, causing him to jump up. "What is he doing?" he demanded. "That's how it works," Nicky said, alarmed. "What's wrong?" "Michael did the same thing to me. It's how he found out how to use the orb. Plus, it hurts, like, a lot." Nicky looked from Darlington to Owen, not knowing what to say. "Well, I doubt it's exactly the same," she said. "And, besides, he's hypnotizing you. He's not extracting thoughts out of your head." Owen still remained upright, staring into the pale, expressionless skeletal face of Darlington. The light from the candles danced off his bald, shiny head. His hands were still held in place, as if cupping an invisible head. It was difficult to forget the sensation Owen had felt when Michael had done the same thing to him the night before. It was as if Owen's head had touched a live, high-tension wire, only a million times worse. Slowly, he lay back down. Darlington gently grasped the sides of Owen's head and leaned in closer to his face. Owen and Darlington looked into each other's eyes. And now Darlington spoke. His lips weren't moving, but the words didn't make any sense. Owen continued to stare into those dark, blank eyes, though. He didn't care what Darlington was saying. He didn't really care about anything at that moment. He just let his mind go. He felt like sleeping, but kept his eyes open just the same. And now Darlington was sitting upright. Owen blinked and looked around. Nicky's jaw was dropped, her eyes wide. "What's wrong?" Owen asked. "Nothing," she said, shaking her head. Owen looked back at Darlington, who was still expressionless. "I thought he was going to hypnotize me." "He just did."
You said a lot of things just now.
Owen was shocked. He didn't remember saying anything. He had just laid down for a few seconds.
What did I say?
He asked.
You said that you didn't make the orb, but that you know who did.
He gave her a curious look.
Did I say who it was?
Nikki nodded.
Who?
She took a deep breath and said,
Your father made it.
Nikki paced back and forth in the room, having told Owen what he had just revealed in his hypnotic state. And he was not taking it well.
There's no way he made it. I remember doing it myself. Well, I'm just telling you what you told me, she replied.
Did I say anything else? She shook her head, but she was lying. Owen had said plenty of things while hypnotized for nearly 10 minutes. Something about taking the orb and escaping from the twins.
I can't believe it,
Owen said as he cupped his face in his hands. He was clearly exhausted. Nikki grabbed a sheet of paper, pretending to study it. I don't believe it, Owen said, more determined this time.
Darlington, this admission sheet doesn't match the amount of money we've taken in,
Nikki said.
We're $40 short.
Darlington didn't respond or even acknowledge that he heard her.
You probably dropped some money before you came in. I'll check the box office.
She left Darlington and Owen in the room and quickly made her way outside. It was nearly 11 o'clock and the air was pretty warm. Unlocking the door, she quickly stepped into the box office and sat down on the stool Darlington used during his shifts. She couldn't get out of her mind what Owen had said during his trance. Since the register count had actually been correct, Nikki made no attempt to search for the $40 she claimed were missing. She just needed an excuse to get away for a moment. She looked up at the moon, which was partially obscured by the scattered clouds. She knew she couldn't keep the truth from Owen for very long. Thinking about what was likely to come depressed her, so she decided to think of something happier. Like she told Owen, she had met Darlington 2 years ago in Birch. She'd left the town out, even though Owen was from there. But she had been on her way to downtown San Sebastian, running away from her family, of all things. While hitchhiking down a lonely highway, she had been picked up by a kind-looking truck driver. Nikki had been very grateful. Things had gone south shortly after when they'd hit an animal in the road. The driver told her to stay in the truck while he checked it out. Nikki never forgot what she saw after that. She watched from the cab as the thing they'd hit lunged onto the kind old truck driver and ripped his face off. It then turned its attention to Nikki, jumping onto the front of the truck, attempting to smash its way through the windshield. At that moment, a pale, skeletal figure emerged from the dark field and tackled the creature, killing it with a swift jerk of its furry neck. Nikki had been hesitant to leave the truck, for her rescuer had been strange-looking. Also, most off-putting was that he had been wearing a silver suit that was almost entirely ripped, making him appear naked, his body covered in burns and scratches. Having heard about the meteor shower that had struck nearby the night before, Nikki thought maybe this poor stranger had been caught up in it. Her beloved Darlington. She'd named him after her favorite flower, the Bishop Darlington, because he hadn't been able to talk and didn't seem to remember his actual name. Nikki couldn't imagine living without her best friend. Something in the distance drew her attention away from the sky. A lone figure emerged from the woods and approached the box office. It was a young African-American man around Nikki's age of 23. He looked exhausted. He was wearing a dark blue shirt and jeans, and crazily enough, flip-flops. "Is it too late to speak with Nicky?" he asked her. Clearly this was his first time here, if he didn't recognize he was already speaking to the one he came to see.
"It is after hours," Nicky said through the slot in the window. "But considering you walked all this way, I guess I can give you a quick read."
The young man gave her a quizzical look. "Are you Nicky?"
"Yes, sir. And who might you be?"
"My name," he said with a smile, "is Curtis Merriman."